The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Well, we are getting our first criminal charges in the Trump-Russia investigation from Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller. Remember, the charges that so many said we would never get, we would never hear about. It was a nothing burger. And of course, many of them will still say that even after I explain to you today what these charges are. It is former campaign chairman and campaign manager Paul Manafort, who has been indicted on 12 criminal charges. Over the weekend, we learned that charges were upcoming, but we didn't know who were they against and what were the charges. Well, now we know a lot of that. Paul Manafort, of course, was under investigation for everything between, I don't know, federal tax law violations, money laundering, lack of disclosure of foreign lobbying money, and indeed 12 counts: conspiracy against the United States, conspiracy to launder money, being an unregistered agent of a foreign principal, false and misleading Foreign Agents Registration Act statements, false statements to investigators, and 7 counts of failing to file reports of foreign bank and financial accounts. Now, the top candidates for me, and I'm not patting myself on the back in any way, I was talking about Manafort and Flynn and Kushner, and it happened to be one of those 3, and we'll see who else ultimately falls. But not a surprise, Paul Manafort ordered to turn himself in. And he is not the only person indicted. Along with Manafort, we saw the indictment of former business associate of Paul Manafort, Rick Gates, who is also wrapped up in this. And we have learned the specific charges. CNN is also reporting that there may be further indictments today. And my expectation when I heard about this on, I think it was Friday that it broke, was the Trump campaign is going to continue distancing not only from whoever it is that's indicted, and in this case, it is Paul Manafort. They are also going to say, well, this doesn't lead back to Trump. We'll deal with that second part in a moment, but I'll remind you, the Trump campaign has been trying to distance from Paul Manafort for a while because it's been clear for some time that he was at the top of the list. Manafort was not only at the top of my list, he was at the top of the obvious list of who the first indictments might be against. Remember Sean Spicer trying to play it very coy, like it's not even really sure what this guy Paul Manafort did. He was with us so briefly.
General Flynn, right. But again, right, and I'm not aware of any at this time. But even General Flynn was a volunteer of the campaign, and then obviously there's been this discussion of Paul Manafort, who played a very limited role for a very limited amount of time. But beyond,
but are you
hey, Jonathan, hold on. Can you stop interrupting other people's questions? Hey, Jonathan, somebody.
Your questions are getting in the way of my completely defenseless apologia for the involvement of Paul Manafort in our campaign. Manafort? Sorry, who? Oh, Manafort. Yeah, we barely saw the guy. I don't even really know who he was. He must have been back with the interns. And the key thing to think about is the denials from people on both the left and right for different reasons about Trump-Russia for months. Can we trust a word those people say? Because remember, they were all saying nothing's going to happen. There's not going to be any official investigation. Well, we've got 3 investigations. There's not going to be any special prosecutor. Well, we've got Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller. The Russia dossier is completely fake and bogus. Well, it's real. It was presented to Trump and Obama, and more elements of that dossier have been confirmed to be true. We aren't ever going to get charges. It's going to disappear. But here we are in October, almost November of 2017, getting our first charges. It's fake news. There's no evidence for anything. Forget about it. What happened to that? And what's happening is that they're moving the goalposts. That is the important thing to keep in mind. The White House is already saying the charges don't relate to Russia and the charges don't relate to Trump. They were merely financial things that Manafort was involved in before he was part of the campaign, which isn't true. The indictment contains dates that were while and after Manafort was directly involved with the Trump campaign. Trump taking to Twitter immediately this morning after the announcement of these indictments, saying, sorry, but this is years ago, before Paul Manafort was part of the Trump campaign. But why aren't crooked Hillary and the Democrats the focus? Going on to say also there is no collusion. Now, of course, this isn't true. Again, Charges against Manafort include actions taken during the time Manafort and Gates were working for the campaign. And it's important to focus on Rick Gates as well. He continued to work for the Trump campaign and even the inaugural committee after Paul Manafort disappeared. It's important to note that Gates visited the White House multiple times this year, 2017, and the goalposts keep moving. If there are charges that are related to the campaign, eventually, we'll hear from the Trump campaign that Trump had no idea and that there has been no intent shown on the behalf of Donald Trump to collude with Russia or be involved with Russia or whatever. No matter what, they are going to move the goalposts always one step ahead of where the investigation is. And that's why you need to focus here. No matter how minor the charges seem, no matter how disconnected, and the charges aren't minor, no matter how disconnected the charges seem from Donald Trump, remember that with Watergate and Richard Nixon, it was nearly 2 years between the first charges and the eventual resignation of President Richard Nixon. Early charges are early because they're often the easiest charges to prosecute, right? The clearest cases and some of the lower people on the totem pole that you can maybe get to flip and cooperate and inform on the really big dogs. Remember Sammy the Bull Gravano, who admitted to killing more than a dozen people. I think it was close to 20 people that he admitted to having killed. He got 5 years because he cooperated and flipped and was able to provide evidence on the big dogs. So doing this early for Robert Mueller and his investigation puts these early indictees, is that the word? Indictees, I think it would be. It puts them in the position of maybe being able to provide evidence for the eventual indictment and prosecution of countless others. Manafort's involvement is a link between Trump and Russia. That is his background. His history is a decade, I don't know how many years, of making big bucks lobbying for foreign countries, including Russia. And his involvement in the Trump campaign is a connection between Donald Trump and Russia. He's the connection, okay? So don't be bamboozled the way Trump has so often done. The fact that there are charges is the news, not whether they directly link Trump to action with Russia. And number two, does this shed new light on the apoplexy and fever with which Trump and right-wing media have been pushing the JFK files stuff and how they've been pushing the Hillary uranium stuff and the DNC wanted the Russia dossier? The timing probably wasn't a coincidence. It is very likely that the right-wing media machine and the Trump machine had a sense that this was coming, and they started the distractathon. Because why all of a sudden are all the tweets about Hillary and the Russian dossier exploding? We have Devin Nunes saying there's a new investigation into Hillary's email. It's all very odd, but it's par for the course with these clowns in the White House. I looked at foxnews.com over the weekend when the charges, news of the charges had broken, but not specifically that it was Manafort or what the 12 counts were. Nothing on the homepage of foxnews.com about it. 7 or 8 different links to articles about Hillary Clinton. So what will Trump's eventual reaction be if this continues to build? We got the bad guys. I barely knew them. Let's get rid of Mueller right now. And by the way, we also learned today that on October 5th or 3rd, I believe it was, George Papadopoulos pled guilty to lying to the FBI as part of the Trump-Russia investigation. Papadopoulos was, I believe, a foreign policy advisor to Trump, who Trump said is a good guy. That is an indictment with a direct connection to the campaign and Trump, okay? So we have not only indictments, but also guilty pleas already stemming from this investigation. Let's now go to the reaction from the Trumpists. The cognitive dissonance and unhinged misdirection from Trump associates after news broke of the first criminal charges in the Trump-Russia investigation has been stunning, and I want to start with you today. Buckle up and get ready. We're starting with Corey Lewandowski, Trump's former campaign manager. FoxNews.com, as I mentioned, mostly no mention of this story all weekend, but Saturday morning's Fox and Friends team did talk about it, and mostly they used news of the then breaking charges against a Trump official that we now know to be Paul Manafort. They used it as an opportunity to slam other networks for overreacting. They bring on Corey Lewandowski. And Corey Lewandowski says, when asked about his comment on the upcoming indictment of a Trump associate in the Trump-Russia investigation, Lewandowski says, the real story isn't being told by the media, and it relates to the Clinton administration. What? Let's take a listen to Lewandowski.
the White House. Your reaction to that?
The dam is breaking. We're never going to hold the water back. Give me a break, okay? Look, the speculation is so insane right now. What we should be focusing on are the continued lies of the Clinton administration, the continued fallacies that they perpetuate. Look, Robert Mueller is doing his job, whatever that entails, and he has now filed charges against somebody that we don't know what they are. We don't know who they're against.
Wait, the Clinton administration, like the one from 1992 to the year 2000 that started 25 years ago and ended 17 years ago? Or does he mean Hillary Clinton, who, of course, didn't have an administration? I'm all for reminiscing about the 1990s like most millennials, but the Clinton administration has what to do with any of this? And I say, let's not stop there. Let's go back to Jimmy Carter. Did Jimmy Carter really divest from that peanut farm? Or did he use clever legal tricks to hide his interests in the family business? I thought there were never going to be any charges, period, Corey. But now that there are, the focus has to be the Clinton administration. And of course, it's never explained. Well, what do you mean? Are you talking about Bill Clinton's administration? Or are you saying Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State? And it's very easy to just write this off and say Corey Lewandowski's living in an alternate reality. I don't know that he is. He's trying to put Trumpists in an alternate reality, and it works every time on them. And think for a second. If Hillary Clinton were the president right now, and there were rumors that, I don't know, John Podesta was about to be arrested, would Fox News be singing this tune that really we need to be talking about the Bush administration or who knows what? Of course not. And this is not Lewandowski in a fantasy world. This is Lewandowski knowing that Trumpists are bamboozleable, and he's trying to bamboozle them. It is not, however, just Donald Trump's former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, who had a totally delusional reaction to the news of the first criminal charges in the Trump-Russia investigation. There's this so-called Judge Jeanine Pirro on Fox News, and we've talked about her before. She's a big Trumpist. She's absolutely vile and disgusting in every way. We have a viral clip called Jeanine Pirro Caught in Embarrassing Contradictions on Free Speech. It's on our YouTube channel. Check it out for a preview or a reminder or a fleshing out of this woman's delusion. She reacted to the news of criminal charges coming from Robert Mueller by saying the obvious, which is we've got to shut down Robert Mueller's investigation and we've got to lock her up, lock up Hillary Clinton. That's what Judge Jeanine Pirro gathered from the breaking news of looming indictments against Paul Manafort and Gates. Let's take a look at her opening monologue from her hard-hitting show on Fox News.
It's time, folks. It's time to shut it down, turn the tables, and lock her up. That's what I said. I actually said it. Lock her up.
Right.
The house of cards upon which the Obamas and the Clintons built the Trump-Russia connection collapsed yesterday when it was disclosed that the Clinton campaign and the DNC paid $12 million for a dossier to connect Donald Trump to Russia.
I can't.
To circumvent federal election laws, the campaign paid a law firm who then paid a research firm who then paid a former British spy to get dirt on Donald Trump from Kremlin-connected Russians. So why is this important?
Tell us.
Now, the FBI had previously worked with this Christopher Steele, who was a British spy, and under Director James Comey, they paid him an additional $50,000 to continue with the research. Now, this dossier was used not only to smear the president, it was used to create a special counsel. It was the basis for congressional hearings, the reason for wall-to-wall anti-President Trump coverage. But in addition to that, the dossier was used as a predicate for further investigation, wiretaps, unmasking, and FISA warrants.
What?
And if it was, then whatever was developed as a result is classic fruit of the poisonous tree. Illegal and unusable.
Completely and totally unhinged. This goes on for 10 minutes, and I can't in good conscience subject you to the entire thing. It's online if you want it. Here's her argument, right? Her argument is the Steele dossier was illegal, and Hillary should have been locked up for it. Completely absurd. And in addition, we only have Robert Mueller investigating in the first place because of the Steele dossier, which is also unproven, apparently untrue. Thus, she says we only have charges against Paul Manafort now because of Hillary Clinton's involvement in the dossier. So shut down the entire investigation and lock Hillary up. Really chaos theory, right? A butterfly flapping its wings on the other side of the planet. For a supposed judge, she really has a very rudimentary or lack of a rudimentary understanding of our justice system. It's not lock her up. It's investigate her, indict her, prosecute her, and if she's convicted, issue a sentence which may or may not include time in prison. It's not lock her up. And her judgeship implies to Fox News viewers that this is sort of relevant and prescient commentary. But these are the ramblings of someone better suited to being a Hollywood gossip reporter than a judge on Fox News. But there are people on the right who love her, and they will be convinced by this. Lastly, in our tour of unhinged delusion in reaction to the news of Paul Manafort's indictment, I try really hard to apply the same standard to all leaks. I think it's fine to explore the legality of the leaks themselves, and I tend to focus on the content of the leaks, right? So when the DNC had those email leaks, I commented on the nature of how the leaks happened, and then we focused on the content. When it was the Trump-Russia leaks, I mentioned how we got it, and then I focus on the content. But most politicians, and especially Republicans, they want to focus on how the leak happened if the content is really bad for them, and they want to focus only on the content if how the leak happened is bad for them. And Chris Christie's doing exactly that. Chris Christie was interviewed by Jake Tapper on CNN, and he immediately goes into, well, the fact that something leaked might be criminal. Here's Chris Christie trying to explain it to you.
So CNN broke the news this weekend that Bob Mueller's grand jury has approved its first charges. As a former U.S. attorney, do you think President Trump's associates should be worried about what might be about to unfold?
Well, listen, I think anybody who's been advised by the special counsel's office that they're a target of the investigation, which I'm sure he has done to those people who are, should be concerned. And I'll tell you what else we should be concerned about.
Tell us.
You know, the fact that CNN has this information. As you know, Jake, there are very, very strict laws on grand jury secrecy. And so depending upon who leaked this to CNN, that's a criminal violation potentially.
Well, listen, I'm sure that'll be looked into, but these are the indictments that Republicans said were never coming. They were swearing up and down, we will never have these indictments. Now we have them, so let's talk about whether we should arrest someone for telling CNN about this. And later, Christie said that the leaking wasn't tasteful. Tasteful? He closed a bridge for political retribution, and a woman died because an ambulance couldn't get her medical help quickly enough, and he's worried about whether this leak is tasteful. And does anyone think for a second that this is actually going to work, that once the indictment is out, as it now is with its 12 counts, its 12 charges against Manafort, that you'll be able to take attention away from it by saying, hey, the fact that we knew about it 72 hours before it went public, that's the problem. And of course, that's not the storyline today. The storyline today from the ideologically committed Trumpists is this doesn't involve Trump and it doesn't involve the campaign. And we'll see how long that holds up. I'm on Twitter at @DPacman. Show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. We'll be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Ivan Velasco. Ivan, thank you. Membership and Patreon are how the program is funded. Appreciate everybody's support at davidpakman.com/membership, patreon.com/davidpakmanshow. That's how the show exists, and we've got some great member perks available. The bonus show, the commercial-free audio and video show, and you can sign up with a coupon code at davidpakman.com/membership if you want a 40% discount. That code is IVoted17. And please remember that if you do shop on Amazon, you can go to davidpakman.com/Amazon before you shop, and that'll send us a little kickback for everything you buy. I want to dig into a particular element of what might be the eventual Republican/Trump tax reform plan. I got a lot of emails specifically about Republicans considering capping 401k contributions at $2,400 a year. And I want to talk about what the micro and macro impact of that would be. Who is this good for? Who is this bad for, et cetera? And to understand that, we need to start with, well, what's a 401k? 401ks are retirement savings plans, and they're sponsored by employers. Sometimes the employer offers a matching contribution of maybe 1% of your salary. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they will contribute to your 401k regardless of whether you contribute to it. But the important part from the end user, from the employee's perspective, is that you put pre-tax money in your 401k. So it reduces the amount you pay on taxes each year. If you earn $50,000 and you put $2,000 in your 401k, you only pay taxes as if you had earned $48,000. The $2,000 that you put in the 401k are tax deductible. Good. That's the basics of it. You do pay the taxes when you use the money, right? So when you retire, presumably, or before, if you want to pay a penalty to get the money out early, you then pay taxes on the money you take out of the 401k as if it were income at the time, okay? Donald Trump tried to deny initially that Republicans are considering reducing the cap on contributions to 401ks to $2,400. Trump went to Twitter initially and tried to deny this by saying, quote, "There will be no change to your 401k. This has always been a great and popular middle-class tax break that works, and it stays." Now, Trump lies all the time, so who cares what Trump tweets? But a few days after that tweet, he backtracked and said, actually, I am willing to negotiate on this issue of the 401k limit. So let's for a second consider what seems to be the reality, which is that there are some versions of the tax plan where it would be explored cutting the maximum that you can contribute to the 401k plan to $2,400. Now, a relevant question is, well, cutting it to $2,400 from what? And that is the next thing we have to talk about. In 2017, the contribution limit for 401ks is $18,000. Next year, the contribution limit for 401ks is scheduled to go up to $18,500. So this is a major cut, and it is bigly regressive. Regressive not in the you're part of the regressive left sense, regressive in the tax sense, right? It will impact the middle class way more than it will impact the rich, and that happens in a number of ways. If you make $50,000, the tax savings provided by the deductibility of 401k contributions really makes a difference to you. If you make $50K and you put $5,000 in a 401k, that saves you $1,250 in taxes because you're at the 25% federal tax rate. That's about $100 a month. $100 a month is real money for someone that's grossing $50,000. If you live in Massachusetts, you're saving another 5.3% on your state income tax. That's another $265. So we're talking about $1,500 a year in your pocket if you earn $50,000, live in Massachusetts, and contribute $5,000 to your 401k. Compare that to someone earning $400,000 a year. If you earn $400,000 a year and you contribute the full $18,000 that you're allowed, even at the 35% tax bracket that you'd be in, that $18,000 saves you $6,300 in taxes. If you're earning $33,000 a month, the way you would be if you earn $400,000 a year, what does $500 a month do for you? You're not making big decisions about lifestyle based on those $500. You're probably saving a lot of that money. So it doesn't make a big difference for you, and you're not going to use that money in a stimulative way. That also explains to us why this is good if you have a tax plan like Donald Trump has, that you're trying to cut taxes for the rich on and trying to cut taxes for corporations. If you reduce the cap on 401k contributions, you shift tax burden to the middle class. That allows more leeway to cut taxes for the rich and for corporations, even though those changes would still explode the deficit, don't get me wrong. Now, the other reason why this is hugely regressive is that if you're really rich, you have more sophisticated tools available to you than 401ks anyway. You can use self-funded pensions. You can use, there's a long laundry list of tools that and vehicles that the very rich have. So you're less likely to even be using a 401k in this way if you're a very rich person. And lastly, this is a total budget gimmick. Remember how I said at the beginning of the segment, when you put money in a 401k, you don't pay taxes on it now. It reduces your taxable income. You do eventually pay taxes on it, though, right? When you pull that money out in retirement, you pay taxes on it then. If you lower the cap on 401k contributions, you will get more taxes paid now, and you will get less in taxes paid when these same people retire. That's really good for the current administration, but it's not a net gain. You're just going to have the taxes paid later on. It'll be some other president's problem, some other president's economy that's going to have to deal with that. And what people will do is they'll move some of those contributions from a 401k to something, the IRA type, for example, where you pay the taxes now, but then you get the money out tax-free in retirement. So it's a way for this president to shift the tax burden into the present and away from retirement. But for the economy, it's not actually a tax benefit. In the net, we're talking about something that is nominally zero sum. And then we can talk about, well, if you're expecting a higher or lower tax bracket in retirement, that could impact it. But then we're getting into a more finely sliced analysis. So what you're doing is raiding the coffers of future revenue for revenue now by limiting how much money people can save now on their taxes with these contributions. This is not universally favored by Republicans. There are Republicans who understand that the 401k is a useful vehicle for lots of middle-class Americans. So we'll see what happens. And of course, I don't want to misstate, there are tons of people who are not in the middle class and who don't even have access to 401ks or don't know the first thing about them. And that's a whole other issue, and we've been talking about that. But the point here is to explain the economic implications at the micro, the individual taxpayer level, and the macro level of capping 401k contributions lower. And I hope that I've done that. And feel free to discuss this with us on our Reddit discussion forum, davidpakman.com/REDDIT. And if my explanation has not been clear, let me know on Reddit and I'll clarify.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Marc Sageman, who's a former CIA operations officer who covered as a foreign service officer and was based in Afghanistan from 1987 to 1989. Marc, it's so great to speak to you, and I'm interested in speaking to you about the sort of epistemology of terrorism, the sources of radicalization. There's so many attempts made to sort of point to how radicalization happens. And I want to start breaking it down with you a little bit if we can. So first, tell us just a bit about your experience dealing with terrorism around the world in your role with the CIA.
Well, I can't say too much about my role at the CIA. However, I can say that I was in direct contact with what we called the Mujahideen then, which we viewed as freedom fighters. Now, some of the same people are fighting against the Kabul regime, and we call them terrorists. So you can see here that the problem is one of definition, and it depends where you stand. If they're on our side, we call them freedom fighters, and if they're on their other side, we call them terrorists. My dealing with them is that they were just like soldiers fighting invaders, namely the Soviets at the time. And I didn't really think much of it. I mean, they were just like the type of sailors that I used to deal with when I was in the Navy, the U.S. Navy.
And is that, Marc, is that a common, would you say in general within the CIA, that there is this sort of amoral view of these sometimes called terrorists, the idea that we may not agree with the side or the movement that they're fighting for, but that operationally, fundamentally, they're not really different than a member of the American military? Would you say that's a widespread view in the CIA?
Well, if they're on our side, we tend to accept them, and we tend to accept them as either freedom fighters or soldiers, just like us.
Talk a little bit about radicalization. In the United States, in sort of layman's terms or popular discussions, we often like to say, well, what we need to look at is religion as the source of radicalization for terrorists, or we need to look at how our or other foreign policy has impacted individuals to understand the radicalization, or other factors. Can you shed a little bit of light on that in terms of what you believe works towards the radicalization of individuals?
The term radicalization, just like the term terrorist, is very confusing, and perhaps we should get rid of it. Radicalization means two things, which are not the same and are indeed quite different. One is the acquisition of radical ideas, namely ideas that reject what people in the mainstream think, and the other is the turning to political violence. And the two are quite different. You can be politically violent but still have mainstream ideas, and you can have radical ideas and be extremely nonviolent, such as Gandhi, for instance.
Yeah, so for our discussion, just that's a good point, and just to be clear, I'm thinking more of the political violence side of it.
Right, and that's what most people are interested. But the problem is that they confuse the two, and just as you point out, one view of it is that they have a radical ideology that leads them to become violent, and that is because of the confusion of the two senses of the term. The two are not equivalent. And so when you want to look at radicalization, namely the turning to political violence, you really need to focus on that. What is the role of ideology, if any, and what is the process by which people become violent? And I basically broke it down in 5 processes by looking at political violence throughout history, going back to the French Revolution. So this allows us to see what's common to all the people who became politically violent during domestic peacetime, not during war, because during war, basically, it's very trivial to think about how people become violent. They just join the army and they're soldiers for their country. But what about peacetime? Well, what we see is that people, for some grievances, acquire a political social identity. And the collection of people acquiring this identity is a political protest community. And the political protest community, we have, thousands of them, and most of them are nonviolent. For them to become violent, you need basically 3 types of condition. One is an escalation of conflict between this community and the state. The second condition is people get disillusioned with nonviolent protest. And the third condition is moral outrage against an egregious aggression of the state against the community. Under those 3 conditions, a few people within the community volunteer to protect their community and become violent against both the state and society.
Now, when you say the state, Marc, does it have to be the state that the individuals are in? Because it seems sometimes the political violence is catalyzed maybe by sentiment against some other state that's not the one that the individuals we're talking about actually reside in.
That is correct. It's basically a question of identification. You identify with a community that's being either persecuted or being killed. And, for instance, anarchists in the late 19th century felt very strongly when other anarchists were being killed by other states like Italy or France. And we have actually a lot of Americans who went back to Europe to for instance, kill an Italian king. So it really depends on who do you identify with. and this becomes an imagined political protest community. So, for instance, because the Assad regime lately was killing Sunni Muslims, a lot of Sunni Muslims around the world identified with the victims and went in to fight against the Assad regime. Over the years, they were basically incorporated in what we call the Islamic State, because they were probably the most efficient fighting force against the Assad regime. Now, when the West started intervening in 2014, a lot of those foreign fighters turned against the West because now the West became an enemy. So it's a little bit more complicated. It's not always against your own state. It could be against another state, but if your own state then engages in the fight as an enemy, then of course your own state becomes an enemy.
Well, there's sometimes this dichotomy in the United States where there are some who like to argue that the roots of at least the current, what we call Islamic terrorism, that the roots are inherently the teachings of Islam. And there are others who like to say, were it not for American or Western foreign policy, you wouldn't see many of these individuals become perpetrators of political violence. It sort of sounds like what you're suggesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you can have foreign policy create circumstances in which religion or another factor can create that outrage that you called part 3 of the radicalization process. Am I sort of understanding you correctly?
Yes, that is correct. It's not so much that a religion creates a moral outrage, is that you identify with people who share the same religion as you do. And when those people are being killed abroad, you become morally outraged, and if your state is the one killing them through bombings, then you decide, you kill my guys there, I'll kill your guys here.
Your work talks a lot about the roots of sort of modern political violence of the type that we're talking about. You talk a lot about the role of Egypt. Can you talk a little bit about that for our audience who may not be familiar with that part of the history?
Well, in this wave of political violence, and again, my last book, Turning to Political Violence, goes back to the French Revolution and demonstrate that the same processes have been going on in the 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century. And in fact, Islam is very late in terms of Islamism, I should say, is very late in terms of political ideology here that may inspire some people to become violent. In this last wave, namely this, what I call the global neo-jihad, Egypt has played a very important role because it, in a sense, developed the rationale that we need to rebel against really our own states before we rebel against the foreign state that prop up our own state. There was a second stage in that that came from Afghanistan, where some people went to Afghanistan to protect and to defend their own community against the Soviet invasion. That was when I was there at the time. And they started to look at, why don't we go after what's called the far enemy as opposed to the near enemy, our own state? The far enemy are the people who prop up our own state. And you start seeing a shift in the 1990s where some of those neo-jihadi attack the West. You know, one of them was the first World Trade Center bombing, and then our embassy bombing in East Africa, and then 9/11, and so you can see the escalation.
Yeah. Let's pause our conversation right there. We're speaking with Marc Sageman, former CIA operations officer. We will continue with him on tomorrow's program.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We haven't had lots of great news about battles that are won against the Trump administration, and we actually got a major win. And it's also a win against crony, crooked, swamp-filling capitalism. Last week, I told you about this really small Montana-based Whitefish Energy. Whitefish Energy had only 2 full-time employees at the time that Puerto Rico was hit by the recent hurricanes, and they were given a beautiful deal for them of $300 million to restore electricity to Puerto Rico. And at the time, I thought, it's kind of weird, right? Why would Whitefish Energy in Montana get this deal? They have, as I mentioned, only these 2 full-time employees. And it turns out that the company was based in the same town as Trump's Interior Secretary, Ryan Zinke, is from. The company had 100 really positive reviews on, I don't remember if it was Google reviews or Yelp or TripAdvisor or whatever. And all of those positive reviews were from the 3 days before they got this $300 million contract. We investigated more. We found out that the company and the company that finances Whitefish Energy both have a long track record of donations to Donald Trump. And it was a clear, total swamp job. And this was criticized by the power industry. It was criticized by FEMA. It was criticized by many elected officials. And I actually have the good news I can report to you today, which is that Puerto Rico's electric company has decided to cancel the contract, cancel the full $300 million contract with Whitefish Energy. Puerto Rico's governor issued a statement about this where he said, as a result of the information that has been revealed and the need to protect the public interest, as governor, I am asking the power authority to cancel the Whitefish contract immediately. And that is indeed happening. And this is the right decision. We've heard denials from anybody who's been in a position to deny that anything untoward took place here. Nothing was done by Ryan Zinke, the Interior Secretary, to get this deal. Nothing was done by anybody in the Trump administration to get this deal. But this is the right decision. It was a total swamp job. And I actually believe that this should be investigated further. If Hillary Clinton isn't involved, though, then Republicans don't really want to do an investigation. And once again, for all the talk of the supposed fake news media that's all over the place and we have to protect ourselves from, it was those investigative media outlets, the Washington Post, the New York Times. That's why we found out about this. And then independent media picked up the story, and it led to the cancellation of a crony capitalist swamp job. And if you think for a second that Donald Trump's hostility to investigative media, which he calls the fake news media, the work being done by the Washington Post and New York Times is so important in knowing what is happening behind the scenes. And you know we're only hearing a fraction of it. Trump going against it, Trump railing against the supposed fake news media, it's not just for optics. Part of it is optics, right? Committed Trumpists love Trump just slamming the supposed fake news media. Part of it is for self-preservation. Media outlets like the Washington Post and the New York Times and many others, they are uncovering really significant stuff. And that's why Trump is railing against them. And public shame has become the #1 motivator for this administration. Think about the $25K, the $25,000 that Donald Trump promised a few months ago to that grieving mother and father of a dead military veteran. Trump never paid the 25 grand. The New York Times and the Washington Post jump on it. Independent media jumps on it. And a check is ultimately received by the parents, dated the same day that the news stories broke. They were shamed into doing what's right. And consider that if this happened during the Obama administration, if during the Obama administration, the president had personally promised 25 grand to a grieving military family and never sent the check, if during the Obama administration, a tiny 2-employee energy company from Valerie Jarrett's hometown had gotten a $300 million contract to restore all the power in Puerto Rico, it would have been the biggest scandal. Well, it would have been #1, the biggest scandal of Obama's presidency because it was so scandal-free. But it would have been 24-hour coverage on right-wing media and on all of the hate media that we see in conspiracy websites. This isn't even the biggest scandal in the last week related to Donald Trump. And with the indictment of Paul Manafort, this isn't even the biggest scandal in the last 24 hours related to Donald Trump, never mind the last month or the last 9 months of the presidency so far. And you need to prepare yourselves because, number one, the White House is going to spin this as, look at Puerto Rico refusing help, and they are not helping themselves. We had this great contract with this terrific company, absolutely amazing company, tremendous company from Whitefish. They were all set to restore Puerto Rican power. And you have Puerto Rico getting in the way of the recovery. That is what you need to anticipate happening here, because that is exactly how they're going to cover it, if at all. And the truth is that now, with the breaking news of Paul Manafort and a business associate being indicted, and another advisor of the Trump campaign pleading guilty, maybe the entire Whitefish story is going to disappear. But there should be an investigation into exactly how this contract ended up in the hands of a company in Whitefish, Montana, with 2 employees. Let's go to your voicemail. The voicemail number is 219-2-DAVID-P. You can call any time of day, but if you call, please don't make logically fallacious assertions like this caller makes. Let's listen to this voicemail, and then I'll break it down for you.
Yeah, David, this is Randall Van Der Eed again, and I would still like to understand your reasoning behind your hatred of Mel Gibson, who basically in his life has never killed a single Jew, and your advocation for this 97-year-old Holocaust murderer that you want to give clemency to.
Okay.
Please explain to me the difference between someone that actually was active in one of the largest mass killings, genocide, in the history, modern history of you know, I mean, how can you just give this man a free pass because he outlived, he avoided all that for so many years?
Okay, listen, let me separate these things for you. So what's the caller talking about? 2 different stories. We recently had a 97-year-old former Nazi guard prosecuted and convicted of crimes during the Holocaust. I don't know if technically they're called war crimes, but he was convicted. And at the time, there were many people who were saying, this guy's just too old, you shouldn't prosecute the guy. And I said, no. If there is no statute of limitations, the fact that he avoided prosecution his entire life means we actually should prosecute him. You don't get rewarded because you avoided prosecution until you were 97 years old. What I did say is you prosecute, you convict if that's what the decision needs to be, and during sentencing, you can consider health in your sentencing decision. That's what I said. I did not suggest granting clemency. Separately, we had an audience question about what sort of political things make it so that you no longer are a fan of either an actor, celebrity, musician, athlete, whatever. And I explained that ever since it was revealed that Mel Gibson is a total vile anti-Semite who went on this crazy rant when he was pulled over by Los Angeles police at one point, all this stuff, I said, the guy disgusts me. I can't look at him. I don't watch Mel Gibson's movies. Do you see how the two aren't exactly parallel? Not watching someone's movies because they made anti-Semitic and disgusting remarks, and talking about the sentencing for a former SS officer or some kind of Nazi involved in the killing of endless numbers of Jews during World War II. You misstated my positions initially, and you're drawing some kind of false analogy between the two. So please understand what I'm saying. I do make an effort to communicate as clearly as possible on the show. And if I'm not communicating clearly, please let me know. But I didn't suggest clemency for the Nazi SS guard. And I am in no way equating Mel Gibson's personal anti-Semitic beliefs to having perpetrated acts of absolute terror during World War II. Okay, I don't know that I can really explain it any more clearly. On the bonus show today, we will talk about Las Vegas shooting victims struggling to afford the mounting medical costs of their treatment. We will talk about crazy Egyptian gay entrapment via an app. And we will also talk about the Kevin Spacey news about both harassment and his sexual orientation. Sort of an interesting story that I want to discuss on the bonus show, which you get access to 2 ways. Number 1, davidpakman.com/membership. You will get instant access as a member to the bonus show. Number 2, by becoming a $5 a month patron at patreon.com/davidpakman show. Make it happen. Thanks for your support. We'll talk to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.